thank you for this generous introduction and the wonderful conversations we were all ready to have during this conference. How do we build communities that remember their violent past without glorifying, normalizing, or normativizing this violence? This is one of the central questions around which a political theology in the wake of Carl Schmitt revolves. In my contribution, I will explore how trauma theory can offer new perspectives to think through the political theological problem of originary violence. Allow me to start with a source that we might perhaps not immediately identify as belonging to the core canon of political theology. Last March, the German hard rock band Rammstein released the video teaser for the new song Deutschland. It shows the band members as inmates in a concentration camp, waiting for their execution. In Germany, where memory politics on the Holocaust are highly sensitive, this instantly triggered a storm of indignation. Are Rammstein crossing a red line by using Holocaust scenes for marketing purposes? And more broadly, in which ways can or should we remember the trauma of historical violence in Germany, and how should it inform German identity today? The release of the full video to the song then revealed that this scene in the concentration camp is by no means the only reminder of a violent past in Deutschland. The 9-minute-long video covers 2,000 years of German history in a frenzy of orgiastic violent images, with each scene capturing in a moment the icons of an era. We see the Roman defeat by Germanic tribes in the Teutoburger forest, the Hindenburg disaster, book and witch burnings, Anabaptists and the East German police state, Bismarck and Marx, swastikas, hammers and sickles, with each scene staged by citations of iconic films such as The Name of the Rose or Schindler's List. As the video goes on, it cuts between the scenes more and more frenetically. The narrative center is Germania, played by a black German actress, and we see this Germania beheading the Roman general Varus, striding through battlefields, being devoured by cannibalistic monks, and giving birth to dogs. As this grotesque version of German history unrolls, Rammstein sings, "Germany, want to love and damn you. Germany, your love is both curse and blessing. Germany, my love I cannot give you." The teaser with the execution scene in the concentration camp, it turned out, was a well-calculated provocation by Rammstein. Deutschland examines precisely the questions that were raised in the run-up to its release. For many commentators, the song presents a delirious meditation about identity, an orgiastically staged struggle with Germany that expresses the ultimately unfulfilled desire for collective identity in the wake of historical trauma. Rammstein's Deutschland can be seen as a critique of growing influences of populist identity discourses in Germany that glorify the country's history. But it also grates against mainstream public historiographies in contemporary Germany, which want to acknowledge the past critically, while also looking towards its future as a resilient, cosmopolitan community. In Deutschland, Rammstein paint a darker version where the country is, torn between contempt for its history and the need to construct an identity from the history. The interrogation of German identity that we see in this video reflects some of the decisive debates in the field of political theology. They revolve around the question of originary violence in community formation and seek to calibrate the tensions that are at stake in the wake of such violence between remembering and forgetting, between sovereignty and subalternity. With Kobe Dickinson, we can discern two traditions in this field. On the one hand, there are communitarian approaches in political theology that build on imaginations of originary unity and stability. On the other hand, we find genealogical imaginations, and we find genealogical approaches that seek to destabilize such archaic founding discourses and hence the deconstructive self-description as anarchic. Dickinson suggests that each of these traditions can be linked to distinct historiographical and theological forms. Communitarian approaches write monumental history. Genealogical approaches engage in critical historiography that seeks to give voice to the silent victims of these, or within these histories of the victors. These political theological traditions Dickinson holds, and I think he's right, find themselves at an irreconcilable impasse. While communitarian approaches cannot account for the violence that is inherent in community foundations, deconstructive approaches are often said to be unable to provide constructive resources for community formation beyond this critique. I would like to argue today that Deutschland provides us with resources for a new orientation in this impasse. Rammstein's grotesque historiography of Germany takes neither an archaic nor an anarchic approach. Rather, it describes history as traumatic and thus activates distinct forms of knowledge that allow us to gauge the political role and the theological status of violence in new ways. And to tease these knowledge forms out, I will bring Deutschland into conversation with Walter Benjamin, an author who belongs more firmly, if not uncontestedly, to the canon of political theology. In particular, his theses on the philosophy of history have been highly influential in thinking through the theological dimensions of political theology, the theological dimensions of memory politics. Here, Benjamin describes the writing of history as an ethical obligation that he frames in soteriological terms. Humankind is redeemed, Benjamin posits, only when its past has become citable in all its moments. This soteriological vision translates into the historiographical norm that nothing which has ever happened is to be given as lost to history, and it paves the way for an ethical concept of history in which past, present, and future are seen as interrelated. In this Jetztzeit, the time of now, history is no longer a linear progression, but contracted into a constellation overflowing with tensions that summarizes, as Benjamin says, summarizes the entire history of humanity into a monstrous abbreviation. We get a first glimpse of such contracted time through the eyes of the angel of history, and it is monstrous indeed. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. With Benjamin, we can register a desire for reparation in this contraction of time. The angel would like to stay, make whole what has been smashed. Yet, the task of repairing is not the angel's, but the Messiah's task. It is Messianic time in which history comes to that standstill that Benjamin describes both as monstrous and redemptive. Benjamin thus draws on theological terms to shape his ethical concept of history, and this in turn allows us to frame the political problem of community formation in the wake of violence as a profoundly theological question. A theological reception of his work, of course, is complex, and when I will bring Benjamin into conversation with Rammstein, I acknowledge these complexities, but I will also explore them as a challenge to reconsider theological interpretations of Christ, of history, and of redemption. This intertextual reading rests on my suggestion that we can see Deutschland as an aesthetic reflection of Benjamin's ethical concept of history. In Deutschland's frenetic citation of iconic elements, German history comes into view as a monstrous abbreviation of a violent past. In its grotesque composition of disjointed episodes, it appears as one single catastrophe seen through the eyes of the angel of history, who arguably does indeed appear towards the end of the video. The psychoanalytical name for such a catastrophe is trauma, one of whose defining characteristic is a rupture in time. Indeed, we can read Shelley's Rambo summary of trauma symptoms as an apt description of both Rammstein and Benjamin. In trauma, temporal categories of past, present, and future shatter, she says. By aesthetically representing and conceptually explicating history as a constellation of disjointed events, both Deutschland and Thesis meet in framing history as traumatic, and both look for ways for forging collective memory in the wake of historical trauma. Kathy Caruth, a major proponent of trauma studies, allows us to unfold this argument. She defines trauma as a profound experience of suffering that resists closure. It is too overwhelming to be fully known until it imposes itself in the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. For Caruth, this absence of immediate understanding implies a call for witness that responds to the dispossession and belatedness of trauma, and it is itself structured by these marks. Trauma, she says, is not marked by simple knowledge, but by the ways it simultaneously defies and demands our witness. Trauma, Caruth says, therefore, is fully evident only in connection with another place and in another time, such that a history is constituted around the site of a wound. Trauma's epistemics of unknowing gives rise to an ethics of testimony, through which trauma cannot be reduced to an individual pathology, but has a historical, has a political dimension. From the traumatic structures of belatedness and dispossession, Caruth thus extrapolates a concept of history that echoes Benjamin's and Rammstein's idea of history. Like them, Caruth too speaks of a contraction of past, present, and future that rests on the overwhelming experience of suffering. And like them, she highlights the resulting ethical obligations and epistemological difficulties to give testimony to that experience of suffering. History, Caruth posits, is precisely the way we are implicated in each other's traumas. History, she concludes, explicating what has been an implicit assumption with both Benjamin and Rammstein, history is a history of trauma. One further parallel between Benjamin and Rammstein allows us to push this argument further and to expose the theological provocation that it bears. In both, the figure of the Messianic features prominently. Yet, particularly in Deutschland, these citations of the Messianic appear grotesquely disfigured. Cast as a Messianic figure, Germania beheads Varus and thus, unlike Christ Jesus, triumphs over Rome. In a grotesque distortion of the Eucharist, she offers her body to be devoured by monks. In the inmate cleaning the officer's shoes, there's a ludicrous allusion to the foot washing. In the end, she ascends into heaven in a glass coffin. These grotesque representations of Messianic owe themselves to an understanding of history as trauma. As Judith Herman has argued, the style of the grotesque, which is an aesthetic distortion that disrupts our habits of perception. So the style of the grotesque, Judith Herman is saying, is the figuration of trauma. And it is thus intimately connected to how both Benjamin and Rammstein conceive of history. As Deutschland's grotesque disfigurations of the Messianic reveal, an understanding of history as traumatic also has major implications for our notions of salvation. Trauma places survivors in between an oscillating crisis of death and life, a crisis between death and life that resists closure and that resists imaginations of full recovery. Resisting closure, trauma allows for imaginations of healing and liberation only within the chassis, only within the framework of trauma. What Benjamin alludes to in his thesis when he says that the Jetztzeit, the time of now, as the model of Messianic time, summarizes the entire history of humanity into a monstrous abbreviation. That, I argue, comes fully to the fore in Rammstein's grotesque history of Germany. Messianic time is a history of trauma, and the grotesque is the aesthetic style in which it makes its appearance. When we read our two sources of political theology together, they thus present us with a challenging argument. Salvation, they posit, remains implicated in a history of trauma, and it is exposed to the epistemological and the ethical aporias of testimony in the aftermath of violence, those aporias that defy to speak of it in self-evident ways. But how viable is such a resituating of salvation within a history of trauma from a theological perspective? How does or how can it do justice to the central Christian belief that a memoria passionis is also a memoria resurrectionis? Ultimately, the theological question that is at stake here is this: which locus does salvific God talk have in a history of trauma? I will explore the theological viability of Benjamin's and Rammstein's argument by looking more closely into the interplay that they have revealed between a history of trauma, figurations of the grotesque, and notions of salvation. Looking how the grotesque functions as a political and as a soteriological category. My goal is to seek for a political theological framework that does not conceal, but rather productively highlights the intimate connection between the traumatic and the salvific. We will start with Mikhail Bakhtin, who describes the grotesque as an innately critical tradition that uncrowns authority by representing it in images drawn from the bodily lower strata. 2 points are crucial here, 2 short points. First, Bakhtin argues that the grotesque can always only be found outside the hegemonic culture. And second, the grotesque goes beyond a negative critique of the social order and also always imagines a utopian alternative that emerges through the inversion of values that the grotesque performs. In Bakhtin's conceptualization, the grotesque appears as a political category with liberative or soteriological import, but the intimate connection between trauma and the grotesque fade into the background. Instead, Bakhtin is interested in identifying through the grotesque, beyond a traumatogenic history of hegemonic oppression, clearly definable resources of resistance, practices of liberation, and loci of salvation. So what kind of political theology would emerge if we read the grotesque messianic motifs in Deutschland through the lens of Bakhtin? With Bakhtin, the grotesque must be seen in opposition to the authority of the state and of the church. And indeed, From the first scene on that shows Germania beheading Varus, I'm sure you remember, we can read Deutschland as a critique of heroic representations of a triumphant Christ that translates into a powerful church, a church that colludes with the state to establish sovereignty through violence. When we follow Bakhtin, we assume that the grotesque is a critique of established power that inaugurates a utopian countervision. Targeting the triumphant Messiah and their ecclesia militants, as we saw it in Deutschland, their goal of the monstrous representation in the video could then be seen to unleash a utopian counter-imagination of a Messiah who does not replicate state violence and instead institutes an alternative form of power. We are familiar with such interpretations of Christology from important strands of political theology. Taking a dialectic approach that's similar to Bakhtin assumes a definite difference between dominating hegemony and liberating critique, they juxtapose triumphant representations of the Messiah to the biblical testimony of a Christ, of a Jesus who is a Christ who failed according to the political and religious status quo, but whose failure to defeat the Roman Empire with military means inaugurates a different, an alternative, a life-giving Basileia. Johann Baptist Metz' political theology is a highly influential example of such a dialectical definition of Christianity that takes its shape by way of a critique of a bourgeois religion. Metz developed his approach in response to trauma. In the wake of Auschwitz, and in contrast to bourgeois religion, he posits that the Christian hope for salvation cannot be conceived under omission of a history of suffering. And in a longer version of this paper, I show how Metz, based on a personal traumatizing experience in the war, describes this history of suffering in traumatic terms. So he talks actually about a history of trauma in which the experience of oscillating between a crisis of death and life leads to a crisis of God, leads to a crisis of God talk, leads to a crisis of theology. Metz, like Benjamin and Caruth, sees intimate connections between trauma and salvation, and seeking to resituate Christian God talk in relation to trauma, Metz then asks, what kind of figuration, what kind of aesthetics soteriology can take in response to trauma? Ultimately, however, Metz takes a dialectic approach that immunizes salvation from the effects of trauma. And in order to see how Metz does that, how Metz separates salvation from trauma, it is instructive to look how he reads Benjamin. He does describe his theology as a commentary of Benjamin, and therefore also makes a memoria passionis the point of construction for theology in the aftermath of trauma. And he suggests to think of salvation as mediated through a remembrance of suffering. Such dangerous memory, he says, has political effects and redemptive quality because it opens trajectories for redeeming the forgotten hopes of those who have disappeared from the history of the victors. Salvation history, Metz argues, as a consequence, cannot be separated from a secular history of suffering. Instead, it is secular history in which meaning has been granted, so salvation history is secular history in which meaning has been granted to the defeated hope and suffering. This echoes Benjamin's concept of messianic time as traumatic, and yet, ultimately, Metz does not fully embrace Benjamin's traumatic history as the basis for his soteriology. When redemption is conceived as remembrance of suffering, it is exposed to the epistemological and ethical aporias of testimony in the aftermath of trauma. These are aporias that defy, as I said, to speak of it in self-evident ways, to speak of salvation in self-evident ways. In Metz theology, however, such soteriological ambiguity has ultimately no place. Instead, he anchors the redemptive effects of memoria passionis to an eschatological proviso that functions politically as ideology critique, and it serves also theologically to hold on to God as the subject of history. Metz thus holds on to a utopian framework that warrants soteriological unambiguity through an ahistorical eschatology, and thus posits a soteriological guarantee that situates the ultimate outcome of the human condition in a realm beyond history and thus beyond trauma. We can, of course, argue that such a utopian eschatological approach is necessary to account for the specific knowledge form of faith when we want to reconfigure theology in the aftermath of trauma. However, I would argue that Metz's approach does not actually offer a problem-free theological solution. By introducing an eschatological proviso that warrants soteriological unambivalence, Metz devises a theology of history that posits that there is a salvific Christian continuum that underpins the history of trauma, and this Christian continuum is, by way of a negative dialectics, clearly discernible through the dangerous memory of the Christian tradition. Relating memoria passionis and memoria resurrectionis to each other in such teleological ways, Metz comes close to reinscribing and resubscribing to central tenets of what he has identified with Benjamin as a historiography of the victors. Ultimately, in immunizing salvation against trauma, Metz does not fully and cannot fully reckon with what he describes as the touch of irreconcilability that lingers over his and any biography of faith in the aftermath of trauma. With this, let us come back to Rammstein's Deutschland. Here, this touch of irreconcilability is indeed palpable. It narrates history as a perpetuation rather than an interruption of a cycle of violence that takes everybody into its grip and blurs the binary notions of sovereignty and resistance on which Bakhtin's concept of the grotesque has rested. After her initial triumph, we see Messiah Germania both as a perpetrator and as a victim of violence. Her triumphant laugh is juxtaposed with tears. Most intriguingly, and with Benjamin in mind, we can see her both as the angel of history who, hopelessly overwhelmed, looks back at the wreckage of history. And we also could argue that we see her as the coming Messiah in the very end, who brings time momentarily to a standstill. The aesthetics of Rammstein's Deutschland, in short, does not fracture the grotesque along binary notions of perpetrator and victim, of triumph and despair, of suffering and redemption. Rammstein, we could argue, does tap into a well-established critique of Bakhtin's optimistic view of popular counter-sovereignty. The Cameroonian political philosopher Achille Mbembe has put it succinctly. He says, the grotesque that Bakhtin claims to have located in non-official cultures is, in fact, intrinsic to all systems of domination, and it is intrinsic to the means by which those systems are both confirmed and deconstructed. For Mbembe, who defines sovereignty necropolitically as the exercise of the power over life and death. So for him, performances of the grotesque can both enable and contest killing as a statecraft. and therefore performances of the grotesque have to be analyzed as to how they produce and distribute death. Mbembe thus explores the dynamics of familiarity which inscribe the dominant and the dominated within the same episteme. And he's particularly interested in the ways in which those who are subjected to necropolitical sovereignty exercise their existence within this framework, within this chassis of death. And from such investigations of how life is eked out at the verge of death, Mbembe shows that political performances of the grotesque find their origins in trauma. I can't go into detail here how he does that, but it's quite impressive of how he looks into slave narratives, contemporary slave narratives, shows how they are rooted in the historical trauma of slavery, and shows how grotesque forms of life emerge from that. And by doing that, he traces how death-bound subjects have been utterly dispossessed of resources that sustain life, but nevertheless spitefully engage in work for life through a reparation that continuously rebuilds life on the site of ruins, out of debris, in ways that cannot but replicate trauma's simultaneous crisis of life and death. After trauma, we can argue with Mbembe, the currency of life is death. And, as he asserts, such grotesque life, forged from the wreckage of violence, continues to bear the traumatic marks of dispossession and belatedness. Reparation in the aftermath of trauma does not allow for closure. It does not congeal into history, but it is bound to the impossibility of remembering. Mbembe thus allows us to reconnect the grotesque as a political and a soteriological category. So he allows us to reconnect the grotesque as a political and a soteriological category back to a history of trauma. Reading the grotesque as the aesthetic style through which necropolitical sovereignty is both produced and contested, Mbembe speaks to the pervasiveness with which the effects of trauma inform history. And yet, he does not gloss over the unequal distributions of trauma such that it would obliterate questions of guilt or complicity. Rather, his conceptualization of grotesque life in the wake of trauma is a reminder both of the impossibility of innocence, and more abstractly, of the related impossibility of a purely singular event. It untethers practices of resistance and imaginations of redemption from utopian warrants, and instead inscribes redemption and resistance with the operatic marks of trauma, speaking to the irresolvable ambivalence that marks the work for life. Wrestling survival from death is continuous labor under the conditions of necropower, where the lines between resistance and suicide, sacrifice and redemption, martyrdom and freedom are blurred. It does not, so this work for life does not replace sovereign power, but it is continuously and precariously at work within it. Intersecting political philosophy and trauma theory, Mbembe's conceptualization of the grotesque as a political category brings a soteriological ambiguity to the fore that allows us to unfold the theological viability of the argument that Messianic time is a history of trauma. And he does this by providing us with resources to revisit the biblical kerygma that Christ crucified is Christ resurrected. And this rereading of this kerygma in turn will allow us to open trajectories for reconfiguring soteriology in the light of trauma. Using the lens of necropolitics to read John's Passion, Beniliev argues that Jewish life under Roman sovereignty was utterly vulnerable to death. And against this background, reinterprets well-established readings of Jesus' initiative in his own death as an act of resistance within the grotesque spectacle of necropolitical power. Like Mbembe, Liev argues that death-bound subjects can but wager their life to contest sovereign power over death. Switching from living within death to dying within life, they make a life out of resigning death. And again, I can't outline or unpack this in detail here, but I really recommend Liev's work here to see how beautifully he actually does this. By reading Jesus simultaneously as a victim of violence and as a colluder in his own death, he finds in John's Memoria Passionis and Resurrectionis an irresolvably ambiguous mixture of rebellion, murder, sacrifice, and suicide. In Liev's reading, resurrection is forged from improvisations within necropolitical sovereignty that make death productive for the unending work for life. And he further shows that such fluidity between death and life not only marks the body of Jesus before and after crucifixion, but also the gospel and the community that are generated from his death. And he therefore argues that the work for life to which John's gospel gives testimony and to which the resurrection of Jesus speaks, this work for life cannot but replicate the simultaneous crisis of death and life that mars the traumatic event of Jesus' crucifixion. The gospel's intervention over death does not overcome necropolitical sovereignty, but is precariously, ambivalently at work within it. Such testimony of life that does not triumph over death, but persists amid the constant threat of death, pushes against the boundaries of traditional narratives of salvation. Liev's reading of cross and resurrection offers political theological imaginations of life and death that untether, that untie a memoria passionis et resurrectionis from utopian warrants. Here, resurrection appears as the fraught work for life from the debris of death that Mbembe and perhaps also Benjamin have described as reparation. A remaking of world through its unmaking, a resourcement of life through the remnants of death that does not congeal into a stable salvation history, a remembering of the wreckage of history that resists closure. Speaking of resurrection as work for life within the chassis of death, it does testify to salvation, but not as an eschatological fulfillment at the end of days, but as a limited event of rupture in the midst of death, a limited event of rupture in the present, not as a dialectical opposite to a history of suffering, but as right in the midst of it. It speaks to new beginnings in ways that have, and we could use Hannah Arendt's phrase here, that have lost all betuliche, all prehistoric innocence. Here, salvation no longer serves as an eschatological proviso that safely underpins the history of suffering. Instead, it becomes an eschatological possibility that is disfigured by suffering. Conceived as remembrance, redemption continues to bear the marks of trauma that defy to speak of it in unambivalent ways. This loss of self-evidence implies that political theology can no longer securely anchor salvific God talk in a discourse of historical victimhood that has informed wide strands of political theology. Such an approach, in which victims are conceived as actually marginal but symbolically central to imaginations of redemption, have problematic consequences. They engage in a consumption of victimhoods that harvests experiences of suffering to sponsor teleological narratives of salvation. And they shift, perhaps conveniently, the perspective of the perpetrators out of view. By relying on historical victims as an indispensable resource for salvific God talk, they run the risk of reinscribing the established distributions of sovereignty and death along the given lines of victimhood and perpetration. The discourse of trauma, in contrast, locates oppression and resistance within the same episteme, and thus it yields a new soteriological vocabulary that resists the potentially violent identification of victimhood and redemption and reshapes imaginations of salvation through the precarious, the ambivalent, the inconclusive reparative work for life that engages in the impossible remembering of the wreckage of history within the chassis of death. Here, in the landscape of the post-traumatic, the question is not, as Shelley Rambo puts it very provocatively, the question is not who will save the world, but instead who will witness its suffering, who will witness its shattering. With these soteriological reconfigurations, it does become viable to theologically speak of Messianic time as a history of trauma. Such a theology emerges on Holy Saturday. It is witness to the women's trembling silence at the empty tomb. It sees the Lord through Mary's tears at the tomb. It recognizes Christ by his wounded resurrection body and in the crucified people of history. It does not flee from trauma's oscillation between the crisis of death and life, but it negotiates the ethical obligation and the epistemological difficulty to give testimony to the death-life experience of overwhelming suffering. This traumatic reconfiguration of soteriology, I would argue by way of a very short conclusion, offer distinct resources for addressing the question of original violence in community formation. And again, I can't unpack that here, but can only gesture towards what is possible here shortly. Resisting a straightforward line from death to life, the knowledge forms of trauma challenge us to stay with the trouble, to acknowledge that some things cannot be made right again. Rammstein has presented us with such a staying with the trouble of a history of trauma. At first sight, it seems that vision seems to be devoid of all hope. No future life seems to emerge from such overwhelming violence. And yet, as Benjamin has suggested, it is precisely such a staying, he wants the angel to stay, such a staying, that might allow to engage in the messianic work of reparation. However, as Benjamin also insists, such reparative work does not congeal into a salvation history. Messianic time is and remains a history of trauma, taking place amid uneven distributions of death. The work for life in the aftermath of violence does not overcome the traumatogenic force of necropolitical sovereignty, but is precariously at work within it, oscillating between death and life. Community formation in the wake of trauma will take place by way of continuous, precarious new beginnings that have lost all innocence. Thank you.